Good evening and welcome to the February 3rd, 2022 Bloomington Planning Commission meeting. The Planning Commission advises the City Council on development proposals, development standards, long-range planning, and transportation issues. Some of the items the Planning Commission has final decision authority, and others the City Council will make that final decision. The Planning Commission is made up of 7 volunteers that are appointed by the City Council for up to 3 years and a term for a maximum of 6. Tonight we have 2 continued, so we'll move through those, and then we have 2 study items. But before we begin tonight, let's say the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, and again, before we start tonight, of course, the Planning Commission is in a hybrid scenario, so we are open to the public here in the chambers, but we also have ability for people at home to participate. With that, Mr. Markegard, would you go through that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission, as Chair Solberg mentioned, we do have the ability, anybody that would like to call in during the public hearings and testify remotely can do so over the phone. Just call 1-888-742-5095. Once you're there, enter in the access code, which is 846-100-1098. And we will have this number scrolling across the bottom of the screen throughout the public hearings tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Markegard. Thank you, Mr. Markegard. And with that, just to make sure, we do have, there are 5 of us here tonight, so we do have a quorum. And with that, we'll start our first item, which I believe Mr. Johnson has a staff report.
Yeah, good evening, Chair Solberg and members of the Planning Commission. We'll get right into your first item here. First item is major revision to preliminary and final development plans for a proposed addition at the Seagate Technology Campus. This just gives you a general overview of what is included in the application. The building addition that they're proposing is a 2-story addition on the south side of their facility. It's approximately 81,000 square feet in size, and it would include a skyway connection to another fabrication addition within the campus. There are some associated site improvements proposed as part of the project, and Seagate is also requesting a proof of parking solution to accommodate some of their required parking, as well as PD flexibility via deviation. So we'll talk about that. For those that aren't familiar with the Seagate campus, it's located just to the east of Highway 100 and north of 494 in that sliver of Bloomington that abuts Edina. In fact, the Seagate facility is partially within the jurisdiction of Bloomington, and the north part of the facility is in the jurisdiction of Edina. So that always presents an interesting aspect or unique aspect to this project, or to this campus. A couple things I'll note is, generally speaking, the access and all of the main transportation that serves this campus would all remain the same. There is one thing I do want to point out here, is that there is a partially improved right-of-way that stretches from West 78th Street Circle over to Computer Avenue, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but as long as I've just got an area map up here, I just do want to point it out. And then generally speaking, the uses in this area are a mix of office and we just had the high density motor vehicle sales facility in this area, so you're familiar with the area just with that recent application. This just gets an oblique image here, kind of closer into the campus. It gives you a flavor. It's a mix of 1-story and 2-story buildings in this area. The shaded yellow area is where they would remove surface parking in order to install this building addition. And then you see the skyway connection over to the east. Underneath here and in here is a truck dock or a truck court where they do delivery of various materials and shipping. And so they still would allow access to that via the Skyway. Here's the site plan here before you. As I mentioned, access is primarily to the facilities primarily served to the west out to Computer Avenue. I highlighted the building addition in green there. Some of the other associated site improvements, certainly they're doing lighting and landscaping and some of the typical things we would see with development. But in the orange areas, those are areas of either existing parking or modified parking, or in the case of this parking on the east side, new parking. So as part of this project, they are installing some new parking, but modifying existing parking in order to install underground stormwater management facilities there on the west side of the campus. And so their existing surface lot doesn't have parking islands and a few other things. So any area that they touch, they would bring that up to code with respect to parking islands and those types of things. A couple other things I'll note just about the staff report quickly. The addition meets all of our setback requirements in the IT zoning district. They are requesting a modest deviation for stairs and stoops on the south side of the building. And there actually is allowances for stairs and stoops to encroach into setback areas, but not within landscape yards. So I just want to point out that modest PD flexibility that they're requesting just on the south side of the building for stairs and landings. In terms of what the building would look like, it would be intended to match or mirror that of other portions of the campus. They've got glass and architectural concrete that's integral in color, kind of an etched or sandblasted type finish. And then there's some metal panels that are utilized at different portions of the building as well. Get into the floor plan. There's not a lot to touch on with the floor plan, but as it relates to parking, I do want to just point out a couple things. This is the first level of the building addition, and actually they call it subfab on the floor plan, but it actually serves to house a lot of equipment that is utilized on upper floors, on the upper floor of the building addition. And then in addition to that, you've got a lot of equipment storage and delivery areas. So Seagate is not a typical industrial or manufacturing use. It's a high-tech manufacturer in terms of chips and other things. So they have a lot of unoccupied space within this building. There's a substantial amount of mechanical and chiller and air ventilation areas and equipment that does, in effect, creates a lot of dead space. And that's something that we've seen in other similar campuses. We have one or two other, or I should say a few other comparable type uses in Bloomington over in the South Loop. And this is very similar to those facilities that has a lower occupancy than a typical manufacturing use. So that just gives you a flavor of the first floor. The second floor, the area that's hatched on the left in the building addition, that's actually the fabrication area where the fabrication activities would take place. But then again, you have a lot of mechanical areas, and then you have a locker room. The fabrication area has to be a completely clean and controlled environment. And then on the right side of the slide there, you see the Skyway connection. They actually have clean and dirty corridors is what they refer to them. And that's so you can navigate in between controlled environments over in other parts of the building, if you will. I just want to point some of that out, and we'll talk about how that relates to the request as it pertains to parking. Talk about it right now. The city code, first of all, on the basis that this facility is partially in Bloomington and partially in Edina, we actually had to work with the applicant to identify what all the parking requirements are in the jurisdiction of Edina. So they did go about that, and we did verify those numbers. And so the calculations that you see in your table that I'll bring up on the next slide actually reflect both the parking requirements of the city of Edina and the city of Bloomington. And so that gets us to an overall parking requirement that we'll show you on the table. They're proposing to provide around 1,400 some parking stalls with the consideration of 170 net proof of parking stalls. So you see along the eastern boundary of the campus here, they're showing surface parking all along that drive aisle. And then in addition to that, they're showing expansions of parking in their existing surface parking lot south of the building through proof of parking as well. There's a few miscellaneous proof of parking areas also shown throughout the campus. And so that's one thing that's important to identify is that they have a substantial amount of proof of parking that they're proposing to record against their property. As long as I'm on this slide, I'll also point out that there's currently 93 parking stalls within that partial right-of-way on the south side of the campus. So one of the things, the reason that that exists is that at some point in the past, as part of MnDOT and other jurisdictions, just future plans for 494 expansions and improvements, it was thought at one point that there was the potential for the frontage road within this area in order to be abandoned in order to expand 494. Now, since further design work or more recent design work has happened for 494, multiple phase improvements, and we're most familiar with the first phase as it relates to the interchange and other things. Now, this whole corridor is in some future phase or another to be improved in order to improve operations at some point. And this area is in, I believe, I was speaking with Julie Long about it, the city's engineer. It's in either phase 3 or 4. I don't recall specifically, but she mentioned it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15 years out is when they would look at. And obviously they would have to secure funding in order to do those improvements. So this is something that is, if it were to ever occur, is a long way out. And MnDOT's most recent design work on their 494 projects show that actually they can maintain, they can keep 494, improve it without needing more right of way to abandon the frontage road. So at this point in the planning process for future 494 improvements, the frontage road would remain, and it's in a very far away phase at this point. So it's likely that this connection would never be needed. So that being said, this backup parking supply, while it can't count towards Seagate's formal parking supply for the purposes of development approvals, it is a consideration for how the city does look at requests for flexibility or what the actual raw parking supply is that serves this campus. So those are the things I'll point out there. Getting to the compliance table, you can see in combination with the 170 proof of parking stalls and the actual parking that is at the campus today, they would be requesting a 9.3% deviation from the city's parking requirement. And staff is supportive of that for a couple of reasons. One, I mentioned the backup parking supply in the right-of-way that's likely to remain for an extended period of time and has the potential to remain for a very long period of time. But the most important factors, and it has to do with our experience in comparable facilities in the community, this property has, this facility has significant mechanical, air ventilation, and unoccupied spaces, as I mentioned before. So it's not a typical manufacturing use in that regard. B, it has a lower employee count on the basis of all of those spaces than a typical manufacturing use. So for example, in the Seagate materials, they mentioned that they would have 45 employees per shift in the new building addition. If this were a typical manufacturing use, according to Bloomington's gross parking requirements, this new space would require 120 parking spaces for an addition that Seagate is telling us is going to be staffed by 45 employees per shift. That just gives you an idea of how the city's gross parking requirements do not mirror well this unique facility, if you will. And then third, as I mentioned, the backup gross parking supply. And we're not entering this into the record by any means, but the city participated in a parking study of a comparable facility on the east side of Bloomington in the South Loop, as I mentioned, not long ago. I think it was in 2019. And that study supported a parking deviation upwards of over 40%. So that just gives you an idea. And not every facility is the same. The Seagate facility does have more office than the facility that was studied, but it does have similar manufacturing equipment and mechanical needs. So it's a good data point, if you will. So on the basis of all those things, staff is supportive of the deviation being requested and sought by Seagate. And if parking demand were to ever exceed what they're anticipating, we would have that proof of parking to execute against to add additional parking to this campus. The landscaping is very straightforward. They're meeting the code requirement with material and all the islands and other typical requirements are met. One thing I'll go back here, just with respect to screening, there is an outdoor equipment yard, and for the potential for new rooftop equipment as well. Those things do need to be screened. So just a point on that. We usually touch on that with the landscaping. There's some other miscellaneous things that have to be resolved as part of that application, and staff has added conditions of approval that address all these things. Hopefully it's straightforward. If there's any questions about a specific thing, I'm happy to return to it. But other than that, we have not received any public correspondence about this application, just to note that for the record. But other than that, staff is recommending approval. And I believe Seagate's staff, as well as their architect and engineer, are also available for questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Johnson on this application? Not seeing any right off the bat. Doesn't mean we can't ask later. And Mr. Markegard, is the applicant online?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have Mr. Leppert and his team as well.
Mr. Leppert, are you there?
Yes, Martin Leppert, Facilities Engineering Manager for Seagate.
All right. And do you would you like to address the Planning Commission in any way on the application?
No, I have nothing to add. I think Nick did a great job explaining it.
All right. All right. Commission members, anything to ask of Mr. Leppert? And I'm not seeing anything for you now, Mr. Leppert. Appreciate you being available for any questions we may have. Thank you. All right. At this point, commission members will go ahead and continue the public hearing on this item. And with that, Mr. Markegard, is there anybody online that would like to speak to this item?
Sure. Mr. Chair, let's check in with Mr. Pease and see if anybody has called in. Mr. Pease, do you have anybody on the line? Mr. Pease, can you hear us? I've got a text. He says no callers online.
Okay. All right. And just to verify, anybody in the room that would like to speak to that item? All right. Commission members, seeing nobody in the chambers and nobody on the line that's wishing to speak to this item, I'd entertain a motion to close the public hearing. Commissioner Roman?
So moved.
All right. Commission members, we have a motion to close the public hearing. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right. Commission members, we have a motion and a second to close the public hearing. Any further discussion on that item? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Public hearing is now closed. Commission members, any discussion on this item? Commissioner Roman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much. This seems pretty straightforward. I appreciate the staff's time and understanding the applicant's perspective on the parking deviation. I think that makes sense, especially with a facility like this. And I think, seeing the problems we've had in our ability to deliver goods in the United States because we don't make enough of these kinds of things in the United States. I am pleased to see this kind of expansion of any facility in our country, but especially in our own backyard. So I'm supportive of this application.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. And maybe I'll just add quickly, I know Mr. Johnson addressed it with the PD flexibility. Certainly the stair step area in the landscape yard, I think, is acceptable as a very minimal flexibility for the type of development in the landscaped area. So I am supportive of that as well. Any other commissioners with thoughts? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion. Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. If I may, make a motion.
Go ahead, please.
In case PL 2021-255, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend approval of major revision to preliminary and final development plans for a two-story, approximately 81,000 square foot building addition to an existing technology campus located at 7801 Computer Avenue and 7850 Nord Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Commission members, we have a motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Corman?
Second.
All right, Commission members, we have a motion and a second in front of us to make the required findings to recommend approval of a major revision to the preliminary and final development plans for a two-story, approximately 81,000 square foot building addition to an existing technology campus located at 7801 Computer Avenue and 7850 Nord Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report. Is there any further discussion on this item? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. This item will move forward to the City Council at their February 14th meeting on the consent agenda. Again, this will move forward to the February 14th City Council meeting on the consent agenda. Moving forward to item number 2, Mr. Centenara, you have a staff report for us?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Item 2 on your agenda is a redevelopment proposal at 8200 Humboldt Avenue South. We had planned on having a public hearing a few weeks ago, but to fine tune the application to present to you, the applicant asked to continue that a little bit. There's several components to the application. One is a comprehensive plan amendment. 8200 Humboldt, as I'll detail shortly, is an office building and is guided and zoned for office uses. So in addition to the comprehensive plan amendment, there is a rezoning proposal to multifamily residential. And then the applicant is proposing preliminary development plans, final development plans for a 4-story, 149-unit apartment building. So I think we're all familiar with the site, 8200 Humboldt Avenue South. We see a lot of redevelopment proposals in land use transition areas, and this is one of those. So this site is just west of and along Interstate 35W. You can see it outlined in red. And then the north boundary is West 82nd Street. So you see a pretty quick transition between the interstate and single family residential. We have an office tower to the north, the interstate to the east, and single family residential to the west and to the south. So a couple images of the existing conditions. So the office building is about 50 years old, built in 1972, a 3-story office building, one level of structured parking beneath. And you can see it's largely surrounded by surface parking to the north, the west, and to the south. Another image there, I consider it fairly typical of this era of office development. And then this is an image from West 82nd Street looking south towards the building. And you can see its relationship to the interstate. So Humboldt Avenue is the local street that is straight ahead in the image, and then the on-ramp is to the left of the image. So as I mentioned, the existing land use designation is office, and that's very much in keeping with an office use, of course. But in order to accommodate a multifamily or high density multifamily development, that would need to be changed to high density residential. You don't have to look very far to find high density residential designations. You can see just on the east side of the interstate, there's a number of high density residential properties, some condos directly to the east, but then north and south of that, you have apartment development. And so this is what was included in your packet is the re-guiding to that high density residential. So similarly, along with the guidance change, there would be a rezoning, and staff we're supportive of the comprehensive plan amendment and the rezoning. We feel that this does meet the policy objectives that are outlined in the comprehensive plan and were detailed in the staff report. And although this site isn't strictly within the Pan American District Plan, it's right across the street from that boundary. And so this is influenced and creates an opportunity for folks to use the transit access to the Orange Line. It is within walking distance to those stations. So that is a factor in considering the rezoning and the land use designation change. So going to the site plan, again, 149 units, and the unit mix is pretty typical for what we see. I mean, the majority of the units would be studio alcoves or one bedrooms, a pretty good chunk of 2-bedroom units, and then 7 3-bedroom units, so a smaller proportion of the 3-bedroom units. This is, of course, the affordable housing ordinance or opportunity housing ordinance is applicable here. And so we do have an affordability requirement. That requirement is 9% of the units affordable to those earning up to 60% of the area median income. The applicant is proposing a higher level of affordability than that, 14 units at 50% area median income. So they are seeking tax increment financing, which is going through a separate process. And the level of affordability might evolve a little bit. I know the applicant may be seeking a different tax increment financing mechanism and offering additional affordability. So I don't believe this will be the last time the Planning Commission reviews this project in some form, but suffice it to say, what is being presented to you tonight is exceeding the OHO requirements as outlined in City Code. With that, when we have redevelopment, there is very often some flexibility that's being requested by the applicant to essentially fit a modern development in a not so modern site. And this site is particularly difficult because it's surrounded by public right-of-way on all 4 sides. And so our zoning setback requirements are usually fairly significant along streets, or the most significant along streets. And in order to have the density that would be required to make this project work financially, they are proposing to locate the building closer to Irving Avenue than what City Code would allow. And so what I'm depicting in this image is the red dashed line is the minimum setback requirement, which is 40 feet from the property boundary. Those yellow rectangles are the areas of the building that would deviate from that setback requirement. And that green area is the portion of the building, essentially open space between the street and the building, and that exceeds the requirement. And so given the courtyard design of this building, you have a relatively modest deviation or encroachment into that setback area, but then there's really substantial open areas well beyond that. And we actually feel that this design is less impactful aesthetically or visually than if it were to be a straight monolith building at a 40-foot setback. We think this design is more interesting and actually reduces the potential visual impact to the single-family neighborhood to the west. So we are very supportive of this deviation. One of the reasons why there was a bit of a delay in bringing this application before you is, again, right-of-way on all 4 sides, and there is some grade between this site and Interstate 35 to the east. And so some retaining structures would be required to allow for a surface parking. And the retaining wall we felt needed to be adjusted to ensure that there weren't impacts to MnDOT right of way, which would certainly lengthen the review process and may not be approvable, frankly. And so the applicant adjusted their plans. We wanted to ensure that the retaining wall was no greater than 4 feet because there's different standards. Once it gets above 4 feet, then it's required to meet structure setbacks. And again, that's 40 feet from the property line. So that's a pretty significant deviation. This retaining wall as is, even though it does not exceed 4 feet, does require a deviation because there is a 10-foot setback even for a low retaining wall. But frankly, there's some retaining wall is necessary. It's either have a retaining wall or reduce the surface parking substantially, which may not work for the development overall. So again, we are supportive, and and appreciate the applicant's adjustments based on staff's comments. And again, once you move one lever and something else changes, and when the applicant was adjusting the retaining wall, the parking lot, they narrowed the sidewalk width a little bit. And so one adjustment that would be a code requirement, and we are suggesting has to take place, is to maintain a minimum of 5 feet clear for a sidewalk. And you can see a 6-foot dimension there. So you might ask, well, why does it need to change? And we want all parking stalls that are along sidewalks to account for vehicle overhang. And the standard we use is 2 feet. So to account for vehicle overhang, but then maintain a clear walking width of 5 feet, we want to see a 7-foot wide space. And so a little bit more work is needed here. We're supportive of a variety of solutions. Maybe it's reducing the drive lane by a foot, or potentially reducing the parallel stalls by a foot. I'm not sure if 10 feet is the minimum requirement, or making some other minor adjustments to allow for the code to be met related to sidewalks. The landscaping plan, in terms of the quantity, it does meet the city code. They are showing a lot of boulevard trees, which would really have a positive impact on the streetscape. I think most of the trees on site now are ash and either are dead or dying. So that would be a positive change. The one comment we did not receive the Department of Transportation comments in time for the packet, but one thing that they commented on was they are showing some trees in MnDOT right of way, which is something that they identified would have to change. And so that's a minor modification that would have to happen as part of the revisions to the landscape plan. Excuse me. But we think that that's pretty simple, a pretty simple revision. Going to parking, again, so with every major development project, we calculate the parking based on the characteristics of the development. And each unit type has a different ratio. And so the total parking requirement baseline is 298 stalls. And however, there are the incentives that apply, and with the incentive applied, the parking requirement becomes 209 stalls. And so the 224 stalls that are being proposed exceed the parking requirement when the OHO incentive is applied. And so regardless, before we went through this most recent iteration of the development, a parking and traffic study was completed. The numbers were a little bit different, but similar ratio of stalls per unit. And the study found that there would be more than adequate parking. Just a couple images of the building. So we're talking about a 4-story building. You can see the courtyard design where you don't have a solid wall along the street. And so not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but it also creates those courtyard spaces for residents because that's where the amenity spaces are being proposed along the lower level. The mix of materials are pretty similar to what you've seen before. A lot of brick facing the street, which is of course a permitted material, and then a combination of glass, of course, metal panels, and fiber cement panels. So they do get to take advantage of some incentives related to materials. The OHO has some allowances, but again, because this development is along streets, it doesn't give them a lot of flexibility because the incentives does not apply to street-facing facades. So the majority of this development will be code complying, given the limited incentive. Another image this is from the northeast corner of the site. You can see a small club room on the top level, and then along the east. And so this image, this 3-dimensional image, would need to be adjusted. The Mini Cooper in the foreground would become a parallel stall. So it's just a rendering change, but you can see the east side of the building is at grade. So the surface parking is at grade. But with that, we are recommending approval. And because of the applications before you, there's 3 motions. One is for the comprehensive plan amendment to re-guide from office to high density residential. There's the corresponding rezoning from neighborhood office to high density residential. and then a motion to recommend approval for the preliminary development plans. And so I believe the applicant is here with us tonight, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Centenario. Commission members, questions for staff? Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Centenario, as you were showing us some of the plans of the parking lot and how some of that's going to be oriented and we know what's tight, it got me thinking, does staff look at snow storage at all? And do we have requirements on applications for that? Or do we hope it works out? Can you talk about that?
Certainly. So we do, excuse me, we do want there has to be snow storage given we live in Minnesota. We don't have detailed performance standards on what that necessarily looks like on a site-to-site basis, but it is a factor on our site plan review. And so we generally look for spaces where snow storage could be located. And, essentially you're looking for relatively open areas where, a plow could just snow. And given that MnDOT isn't going to want snow on in their right of way, it would need to be identified on site or stored on site. And the two most obvious areas are the green space to the north of the site. That is a pretty substantial green space, and without really park improvements, landscape, of course, but there wouldn't be an obstruction to keep snow from being stored there. And then the southeast corner, where there's another open space where snow could be stored. So the parking facility isn't tremendous, and so generally speaking, we were comfortable with the spaces that would be made available for snow storage.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Centenario, do we know, and I apologize, I should have thought to ask this earlier to give you more time to see if you had it. Do we have data, or does the applicant, I can ask the applicant, I guess, that when they get on as well, do we have data or visuals that show the shadow study at the required setback versus the proposed setback? Because it was not the best quality graphic, but it appeared to me that there was significant shadowing in the morning hours in the winter months.
Sure, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman. We do not have the shadow study for what the shadows would have been or would be at the required setback. We just the shadow study was based on the proposal before you.
Sure.
And even though, but certainly there are some shadow impacts, especially on the winter solstice. That said, even though there are morning impacts, there aren't any afternoon impacts. So it is code complying, given our allowances for shadows.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. One of the questions that I have is really around accessibility and safety for some of the residents. So thinking about the location of this, and you mentioned there's some green space on the north side of the property. Is there fencing or screening to prevent, I'm thinking, kids playing out in that green space from them, going out into the streets or even getting into 35W? Just thinking about some of the residents and kids and thinking about how we can prevent, an accident or something to happen with kids in that space.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Chair, Commissioner, we definitely want there to be some barrier when you have a potential fall risk. So, one area certainly is the entrance into the parking structure. That's a pretty significant retaining wall there. And so that's just an example of where we would want to see some level of fall protection. And then maybe some along this east retaining wall, although the height of that wall is much less. In terms of the green space along the north, it is a fair ways away from the street, and there would be an 8-foot wide sidewalk between that green space and the street. And so whether it's landscaping is sufficient to provide that visual barrier, or if there actually needs to be something like a physical fence, that either would be alternatives for the applicant to take advantage of. But they have liability to be concerned with, so they may have some thoughts on how best to manage it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other commissioners with questions for staff? Let's see, not seeing any. We'll go ahead and staff. Let's see, applicants are available. Would you like to come up and speak to the item at all? And if you could just announce your name into the microphone, and we don't have a sign-up sheet tonight, but.
Sure. I'm Brian Bachman. I'm with the Enclave companies. No, I don't have a whole lot to add. Michael did a super job, but I'm certainly available to answer any questions anybody might have.
Okay, and if I can, commissioners, any questions for Mr. Bachman? Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bachman, I'm just curious what your engagement with the neighbors has been and what you've heard from them.
We've actually had 2 neighborhood meetings with them. We had one last year and then had another one in January to just kind of give everybody an update because the plan had changed slightly and just wanted to get everybody kind of up to speed. The neighbors were really nice. They asked a lot of really good educated questions, but didn't seem to have, I think in a perfect world, they'd love it to be a giant park, but I don't think anybody's really in love with with their view right now. So I think they're looking forward to having something that's updated and going to be a little better taken care of.
Thank you. Any concerns that you felt that do you feel you were able to address any concerns that you heard?
Yeah, I think we did. We both meetings were pretty well attended, and like I said, very active and engaged folks. So we were happy to be able to get their input. We when we first started designing it, we worked really well with city, with staff, with Glenn and his team on how to best lay this site out. We've had, oh goodness, 3 or 4 different iterations of this building to try to kind of make it what worked the best for the neighbors, because that was really kind of our primary focus was, Irving, and how do we become a good neighbor? And this latest version where we did, the backwards E worked really well because most of our, of the frontage of our building now is set back even farther. So it did a nice job of breaking that up along Irving.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Mike. May I add something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I should have included my presentation, but when you have a redevelopment of this scale, especially if it's multifamily redevelopment, we often hear some concern from neighbors, that there will be traffic impacts or property value impacts. I have not received any correspondence or even phone calls, frankly, from concerned neighbors, which I frankly found a little unusual, but I think that speaks to the applicant and the efforts that they made to meet with the neighborhood and then to design a building that was less impactful.
Thank you. Maybe just one question, because it was brought up with the commissioners for staff, just thinking about snow removal. I can certainly see there are a couple spots, but as I understood that green space on the north, what are your thoughts on that? Are you guys going to remove most of the snow? Or are you going to?
We're from North Dakota. We do snow. So yeah, this is going to be probably a truck site. When we have a small amount, you have 2-3 inches. Yeah. Sure, there's some areas we can push it. If we have a good North Dakota, Minnesota blizzard, there's going to be trucks coming in to get it out.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. Any commissioners, any further questions for Mr. Bachman? Not seeing any. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. With that, commission members, we will go ahead and continue the public hearing on this item. And with that, I'll start first here in the chambers. Is there anybody else that would like to speak to this item? Nope. All right. And Mr. Markegard online. Is there anybody online that would like to speak to this item?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have one caller, Mr. Cliff Carlson. And Mr. Carlson, I will unmute you now.
Go ahead, Mr. Carlson.
Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we sure can.
Okay, great. I'm just concerned about the traffic on 82nd Street. We got this freeway improvement plan coming through, and I think that's going to be bad enough. But then we add more traffic. I think it's going to be impossible to get around on 82nd Street, during rush hour traffic. But I don't know how you can figure that out. But it just seems to me like I don't think the freeway plan is doing a very good job of figuring that out. And then adding this to it, I'm not very happy about that.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Carlson. And I just as I can maybe a quick response. Planning Commission itself had concerns about some of the traffic on 82nd Street. Although being a long-standing plan with the city, we had asked the public works staff to really look into that and what are the sorts of things that can be done to make sure that community members that might be on the south side trying to traverse to the north side can do it safely, and our own residents traversing through the city. So please be assured that our fine city engineers are working on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Again, this is Mike. Sorry for interrupting.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add that there was a traffic study prepared for this development. And again, because it was a previous iteration, it didn't study this exact footprint. But the characteristics overall from a traffic perspective were very similar. And, the traffic engineer, but the traffic study didn't find any adverse impacts for this development.
Sure.
If it were to come to fruition. So we do have some folks available tonight if you want to discuss that further.
Okay. All right. All right. Anybody else online, Mr. Markegard?
Mr. Chair, we have no other callers online.
All right. Commission members, seeing nobody else in the chambers that would like to speak to this item, nor online, I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing. And Glenn, can you move that screen? Commissioner Roman.
It's so moved.
We got to get the technology caught up. So, commission members, we have a motion in front of us to close the public hearing. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman.
Second.
All right, commission members, we have a motion and a second in front of us to close the public hearing. Is there any further discussion on that? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman.
Aye.
Commissioner Corman.
Aye.
Commissioner Roman.
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi.
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon.
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. The public hearing is now closed on this item. Planning Commission members, thoughts on the application in front of you? Maybe all, Commissioner Goldsman, there you go.
I'll start. Thanks, Mr. Chair. First of all, I think additional housing in Bloomington, we've had this come up many times, is something that we need. And this is a great opportunity for us to bring in new housing. I really appreciate that we're taking an old office building that may need, a lot more development or TLC, and making it something new and reutilizing that location and property. So I'm very excited about this. I also appreciate that the developer reached out to the neighbors and had public meetings and talked to the neighbors about some of the concerns and questions that they had. And I think being a good neighbor, especially since they are surrounded by single family homes, is a good step in the right direction. So, in short, I'm in favor of this application. I think the rezoning makes sense, especially for the location that it's in. More housing to Bloomington is great, and we'll be supporting the application as it stands, obviously with the conditions in the staff report.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Goldsman. Appreciate that. Commissioner Cookdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to make a quick comment on this is just a terrific transitional use between the very busy 35W corridor and the single family homes to the west. I think it's even better than what was there before with an office use, which is not always compatible with single family homes. Certainly this is better, and I'm happy to see a nice transitional use here. So I am in support of this.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookdown. Appreciate those comments. Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will concur with what has been said on the reuse of this property. I think back many moons ago when I used to drive to work every day and would get off the freeway at this exit and watch the letters of one of the previous tenants slowly fall off the building and thinking, what is this? Is this just kind of a prime real estate and it's just kind of deteriorating? So I appreciate the applicant and their thought in this. My concerns were, as you heard, my questions about impact on the neighbors, especially from the shadowing. If we were going to be granting the ability to move closer to the west, and I've heard we heard from the applicant that they have done that outreach, and the staff has validated that, so I'm comfortable with that. And then I also think that the individual we heard from the community about 82nd Street, and I'm not concerned about this project creating massive impacts on that, but I think it's just a good reminder that it would be good to have our traffic staff perhaps give us some more frequent updates on the work that's being done. I know the last time they were in front of us, kind of the response we heard was, well, what do you think, or what are you worried about? Or not, I don't mean in a negative way, but what are the things you're worried about that you want us to address? And so I think, what we heard tonight and what I know I've observed in my own driving in that area, significant needs for increasing the pedestrian experience. So Mr. Marketer, maybe we could put that on the list at some point in the next few months to have a check-in with staff and perhaps more frequent ones as this plan develops on that corridor. But as far as this application, I too am supportive.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Roman. Any other commissioners with comments, thoughts on this particular application? And in the meantime, I think I'll just add a couple comments. I do appreciate the applicant in this instance talking to the neighborhood. That's very helpful for the Planning Commission to understand where the neighborhood is coming from. Oftentimes these sorts of developments may be right on the edge of being good and passing and not passing through the Planning Commission for reasons that are really could be solved with more communications with the neighborhood. So really do appreciate that. And as we talk about this, again, back to, and I think Commissioner Goldsman, you mentioned it, the housing need in Bloomington and the region as a whole. But one of the things I really appreciate in this one that we haven't seen quite as much of are the 3-bedroom apartments that haven't necessarily showed up in some of our other developments. We do have families that want to live in Bloomington, and this is another way for them to start here and move on to potentially move on to other developments within the city. So again, appreciate that. As far as the again, minimal flexibility that's really able to be achieved, I appreciate it, and that you guys are able to take advantage of it. It's unfortunate as you're limited with some of it because of the public right-of-way on 4 sides of it. But maybe that's something to think about as we look into future developments and what the affordable housing, the opportunity housing ordinance allows for some of our developments. And just what are we achieving or not achieving by limiting that. So with that, I again would support the application for approval tonight. So any other commissioners with thoughts on this? Commissioner Cookdown.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And we've all said how much we like it, but I do have one other comment. I was pleased to see a full supply of covered parking spaces. That seems to be something that has been trimmed out a lot of some of these applications we've seen recently that are meeting affordability goals. I was pleased to see a full complement of covered parking. If there's no other comments, I am happy to make a motion.
I do not see anybody else with their hands raised, so please go ahead, Commissioner Cookdown.
Mr. Chair, in case PL 2021-257, I move to recommend the City Council adopt a resolution approving a comprehensive land use guide plan amendment to re-guide 8200 Humboldt Avenue South from office to high-density residential.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookdon. Commission members, we have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Corman?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to second.
All right, Commission members, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend that the City Council adopt a resolution approving a comprehensive land use guide plan amendment to re-guide 8200 Humboldt Avenue South from office to high-density residential. Is there any further discussion on that item? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Moving on, we have a second motion. Commissioner Cookdon?
Sure, Mr. Chair. In case PL 2021-257, I move to recommend the City Council adopt an ordinance rezoning 8200 Humboldt Avenue South from B1 Neighborhood Office to RM50 PD High Density Residential Planned Development.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Cookdon. Commission members, we have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right, Commission members, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend that the City Council adopt an ordinance rezoning 8200 Humboldt Avenue South from B1 Neighborhood Office to RM50 PD High Density Residential Plan Development. Any further discussion on that? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. Moving on, we have a third resolution. Commissioner Cookdon?
Mr. Chair, in case PL 2021-257, I move to recommend City Council approve preliminary and final development plans for a 4-story, 149-unit apartment building located at 8200 Humboldt Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookdon. All right, Commission members, we have a motion in front of us. Is there a second? Commissioner Goldsman?
Second.
All right, Commission members, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend the City Council approve preliminary and final development plans for a 4-story, 149-unit apartment building located at 8200 Humboldt Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report. Is there any further discussion on that item? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Aye.
Commissioner Corman?
Aye.
Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. That item will move or those items will move forward to the City Council at February 28th as a public hearing item. And again, February 28th City Council meeting as a public hearing. And with that, we appreciate the applicants here tonight. And that concludes our public hearings for tonight. We'll move on to a study session item. And I believe, Mr. Palermo, you have a staff report for us.
I do. Let me share my screen here. Oh, sorry, this is going to happen. They updated us to Office 365, and I need to find where to turn that off. Let's do that. Nope.
You're almost there.
You know, it's somewhere. A slideshow keeps. Sorry about this. I should have.
There you go.
Oh, I think this is what I want.
Oh.
No, it keeps putting it on my other monitor. That's why.
I see.
Let's try this now. There we go. Okay, so this is our study session for miscellaneous issues. So a little bit more informal discussion. So feel free to jump in if you have questions or clarifications or issues. I think everyone here has gone through the miscellaneous issues before, but if not, this is kind of our annual update. We're a little bit later here. We had some turnover in our legal staff and just need to get people onboarded before we went through this because it is a more time intensive ordinance update, although on scale it's not, you'll see, not made any major issues. But we take this time annually to look at issues that maybe there's outdated references to state code that are wrong or erroneous things that we find from time to time in the city code. Throughout the year, we make interpretations on different things, and it's easier for us to codify it rather than rely on an interpretation to make sure we're having that consistency annually or on a regular basis. And then sometimes there's just little issues that come up that we'd like to change or add in, that kind of smaller, little bit more substantive. Maybe it's new to the code, but it's still not big enough to warrant a whole study or ordinance moving on its own. So we kind of lump it together in our miscellaneous issues. So I think there were 16 ordinances this year. So the way we do it, we kind of break it down. I letter them for kind of jumping around for us to talk about A through O. And that A1 is more cleanup items that are lumped together. And they were ordered this year at easiest to hardest, but are more complex, and I'll probably flip it the way that we talk about this discussion. But when we get to the public hearing, this way, if there is an issue with one, we can kind of pull it out when we make a motion. Say, I make a motion for A through K, and an O, or, it allows us that flexibility moving forward rather than derailing the whole ordinance if it's all included in one. Plus, these are all kind of separate, distinct items. So from a legal perspective, we want to make sure that everyone is clearly noticed and kind of separated it out. So I'll start with kind of the more complex ones. So moving backwards. So O is sidewalk link requirement. And this is one of those situations where we are already kind of doing this. We will require for new developments or significant redevelopment with conditions of approval that you have a sidewalk link to the public sidewalk. Like I said, we've been doing this in our conditions, but this way, having it in the code, it kind of makes clear upfront that this is something that we're likely going to require when you get a conditional use permit. We do have this requirement for new construction, but this will kind of make sure that our conditional use permits are kind of wrapped in that development. So, are there any questions on this one?
Well, I think that's part of what we've talked about over the last couple items. I appreciate this coming up.
Yeah. Great. So this one, dogs on outdoor patios. It's hard to imagine sitting in an outdoor patio today, but hopefully by the time this goes through and summer comes, we can start thinking about this. But right now, dogs are not allowed on patios with food establishments or where food or beverages are served. So the state does allow cities to allow this, but they do have some requirements that have to be in our code to allow that. So in the proposed language, we'll have a permit, so that's part of kind of their inspection review. There'll be kind of designated contact information, but then we have these kind of 6 standards that are outlined. And they basically go into, what happens if there's waste from the animal or employees are not supposed to be touching the dogs. sanitary items here, just to make sure that there is that kind of environmental health aspect to it being enforced. So any thoughts on this? I know this is one we've talked about in the past too in the brewery discussion, and this would be applicable, to different outdoor establishments.
Are these requirements consistent with what the state puts out as should be the requirements, or other cities are doing, or are we within those, or are we an outlier?
Yep. So I believe most of them, if not all of them, are the state actually requires. It outlines that you have to require it. I think they all are derived from there, but it's pretty consistent with what other communities are doing.
And what is the reason that we would require a special permit for this versus having it just be a requirement of a broader permit that you'd have for this type of an establishment?
The reason for that is because not every establishment is going to have this. It takes that extra level of review. So it's just an extra indicator that this is something that's going to happen at this establishment, whereas another establishment that might have a patio, if they haven't gone through that extra permit process, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. So that's part of why there's that permit.
Okay.
It's essentially another permit tacked on.
Yeah, would that be a one-time thing or a recurring thing? I'm just trying to think of the impact and the cost on a business who wanted to offer this.
Right.
Yeah.
I believe
Mr. Markegard may have a comment on that.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman, I just wanted to note that state statute does require cities to issue permits. We can't allow it without issuing permits. So what we've tried to do is keep the expense as low as possible. Mr. Palermo, I don't know if you have the fee, but I think it's very low. It would be.
yes.
Great. Well, the fact that we're
$50
required to do it is helpful to know.
So it's a $50 permit fee, and it's annual, so it would be annually renewed.
Mr. Palermo, just maybe continuing this a little bit further than just patios. Certainly, there are some establishments across the border and to our north that allow, I think, dogs into certain facilities. Does Bloomington allow that with permit, or is that currently prohibited, or can you tell us some on that? It seems to me that if we're allowing maybe on patios, we may have other restaurants that it's virtually open to walk into. Why wouldn't that be allowed there, or is it allowed?
So at this time, Chair Solberg, we would not be doing indoor. I think there's some question on whether they're able to do that. I think it depends on the type of establishment. I think with food establishments especially, I don't think they're allowed to do that. But I think with breweries, there is a kind of gray area, if I remember correctly. But at this time, I don't think our environmental staff, judgment enforcement, who would be kind of taking this on, they're not ready to do that indoors yet. I think that's one of those. Let's start here, and if there's a demand for that, potentially discussing further years.
I think I got most of it. You were breaking up a little bit, but not quite prepared to look at it yet, but could be in the future here. And I would just ask that, we be consistent across the board as we look at this, or at least consistent with some of our neighbors and the types of uses that they allow.
Yep. Any other comments? All right. So this next one, at this time, the state of Minnesota does not allow sports books or betting, but it is anticipated that they'll likely approve that pretty soon. So this is more in anticipation of that being approved, that, as we look at off-track betting or these kind of bedding facilities. It really is just kind of like any other indoor recreational use. So we're just going to add that to this definition, just to clearly state where it should be located.
Looks like Commissioner Cookdown would like to speak.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Mr. Palermo, I just wanted to say thank you for putting this on the books. This was something I had brought up, and I'm pleased to see this has been clarified. And hopefully one day in the future, we can bet in our own backyard that the Vikings again will not win the Super Bowl.
Better watch it. They got a new coach.
Yeah. This next one is for temporary signs for new multifamily buildings for lease up. So we do have some exemptions in our code for signage that you don't have to get a permit, and we do have that for leasing signs. But they're pretty narrowly tailored, and you'll see them throughout town or throughout the city where they're kind of permanent and pretty limited in size. But really that first year, those first 2 years are kind of the critical point for new buildings to lease up as quickly as possible to get that cash flow. So that we recognize, that it'd be beneficial to them to have this extra temporary signage just to, first identify that the building's open and then it's leasing, and it would start at the certificate of occupancy of that building, that kind of ticking clock. So they'd be exempt from signage. It'd be a little bit bigger signage, but it would be temporary in nature. Any comments on this?
And it is specific to multifamily, right? That's what I'm reading now, the change. So
yeah,
I think that what we've heard from some of the developments, that it does take a while. I myself don't have any issues with this change.
Mr. Palermo, I'm seeing 35W, 494, and 77 included here. Was there consideration for 169?
So that is actually the section above it, leading into it. I just wanted to kind of highlight, this was just to remind me that there are some exceptions we have already in the code for lease-up signs, but this would be a new section, an additional signage. So we do have some differences on our kind of more permanent lease signs for those that have those frontage. So that is something to discuss. Yeah, if we add 169 to that. Trying to think of property along 169 that might want to take advantage of that.
Thinking about future usage, if somebody wanted to rezone, or I know there's that senior living facility, I think is on 169 on the northeast side of Bloomington, or northwest, excuse me. I don't know. It seems like a odd one to not be included.
Was 169 potentially left out simply because of the level of noise walls that are there? Compared to 77 doesn't have quite as many, 494 doesn't, and 35 have some gaps as well.
Mm-hmm.
What about sections of 100 as well?
Oh, sure.
100 turns into Normandale, but as long as it's that northern edge, it might also be good to include.
Yeah,
apologize, Mr. Roman.
Out for some reason, I would agree with those who've said just let's be consistent and just list them all. Or we could just say a federal or state highway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's something we could add and kind of include in that update. So this one is another, so allowing dog runs in landscape yards for multifamily projects. They currently have to meet the building setback, which is often 40 feet for our kind of RM districts. So I think I'm trying to remember where it came up, but you can see an example here with this is the Fenley where maybe they would encroach a little bit more and it wouldn't be super impactful. So a dog run is kind of a fenced-in area, but it's open and consistent with kind of open space. So it's not really, from staff's opinion, in conflict with that landscape yard purpose. But so we would allow this in our permitted encroachment, but we'd still have a little bit of a setback from any kind of sidewalk to kind of just acknowledge that some people don't like dogs and don't want it right up against, the public area.
Do we have a definition of dog runs?
I don't believe we do.
I mean, the only concern I would have there is maybe the experiences. In some cases, it's a grassy area. Some I've seen are enclosed by fence. And then you start bringing in, well, if it's not defined, my dog run, I have a 6-foot fence in the front yard, which may be prohibited anyway, but just wonder how imaginative people can get to say it's a dog run. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe have that kind of fencing. Yeah. Well, in this case, it does say fencing must comply with city code requirements, so they wouldn't be, yeah.
But not knowing what a dog run might be in conflict with what we think of as
we could add that definition. Yep.
If that's maintained grass, fencing is in accordance, and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that works, but if it turns into impervious surface and that sort of thing, it might be different.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Item J. So this was an interesting one that just came up. I think Londell caught this one, where we have this definition of private stables for horses, and you're allowed a maximum of 4 horses in your private stable, but you can have a stable that's 6,000 square feet apparently. But we actually traced it back, and at some point it used to be 600 square feet. I think in the 50s we found a code that said 600 square feet. So we think at some point a comma was added and a 0, and it just kind of stuck in there. Obviously, this is not one that comes up very often, but just one of those clarifications. Any issues with this?
Seems like a good fit.
And I did double check 600 square feet is enough for 4 horses. They typically have a 10 by 10 or 10 by 12 kind of stall, so it works.
So as a follow-up, sorry to interrupt. So as a follow-up to this, just to understand what this means. So in Bloomington, if you have a property that allows for this size stable, you technically could have up to 4 horses, but are there other requirements for having a horse in Bloomington? I'm just wondering, I was trying to get my head wrapped around having a horse in Bloomington.
Yeah, so we do have a whole bunch of kind of animal in our animal code requirements for like what the stable requirements are. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of other requirements for that as well.
Okay. Would there be any properties in Bloomington that could apply? And the reason I ask is if we have so many restrictions on this type of property, the size of the property, do we even need to have this correction, or do we just strip it from the code?
There are properties that could potentially meet it, especially along the river valley. There's some kind of larger properties that have the space for this. And I actually live in Eden Prairie, and right on the other side of 169, there's a residence there that has horses. And so the likelihood of it coming up is pretty low, but there are some properties that could that could utilize this.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Markergard.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Goldsman, very, very few properties in the city that would be eligible. However, there are a few, and we've received recent questions on one, which triggered staff reading this definition that's been around for a long, long time.
So the next one, this is another one where we kind of had an interpretation, but it just makes more sense to codify it. We do have some prohibitions on windows that are facing private streets and public streets, that you can't cover more than 25% of the window area with kind of signage. We do allow for blinds and curtains to kind of sun blocking. But in this case, this is a kind of example where you have it completely blocked out with signs. We're seeing more of this kind of film that covers your window that has logos or some sort of graphic design that's really more of a sign than it is kind of that shading. So we just wanted to include that in that to make sure that distinction.
Is that,
Any questions on that?
that requirement, is that per structure or per business?
That is a good question.
I'm assuming it'd be interpreted to be per structure, but I'm thinking of a particular location where something is showing up, and but the business next to it doesn't have. So
Yeah, I would agree with the idea that it should be per business. I mean, this is kind of like what we talked about a while back, or about the was it signs or other things we were talking about, and who can have the temporary signs and whatnot. I also think, I don't know if there's blinds, curtains, and temporary coverings, for privacy or something. That I get that. I struggle with when we have, I don't know if we should have any sort of nuance about, in some of our areas where we have street activation, this is intended to be street activation essentially. Should there be a different standard for something where the windows are right up to the sidewalk versus, where the windows indeed face the street, but it's a 60-foot setback? And we certainly don't want them all covered, but I just think about how do we, so someone takes down their stuff, but then suddenly they put up a set of curtains or blinds with the same thing printed on the back of it, or whatever it is. Again, the idea of, in some of these places where we have, almost no setback, is to encourage some sort of activation. So when you walk by it, it feels alive, and even blinds in that kind of a setting would not do that.
So I did get some clarification. So that 25% is actually per window pane. So it's not necessarily per,
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, and so this is also, there are certain zoning districts, but most of our commercial zoning districts, this is applicable in.
Well, I agree with the adding the additional film covering with signage. I think that's another good piece to this. Maybe some of the other questions for us are clarified, since now you said it's 25% of each window area. It says total window area. So it's not each window. And again, the question comes up, total window area of a building or a business. One business, if there's 4, could be completely covered, while the other 3 are open, and I don't think that would meet the intent of what we would like to see, especially with what Commissioner Roman just said about kind of some of these areas where we're really trying to activate the street versus maybe some others it might be more appropriate, but
Yeah. So Londell is making a comment to me that if you look at each window individually, it's less calculation for us to figure out. So it's easier to enforce that way, looking at each individual window pane. And maybe there's some update I can do this to kind of make clear that it's each window pane and not window, because it does say window area, which is kind of maybe a little misleading. So
sure.
I hate to do this, but Mr. Palermo, what about the type of signage that sort of like lets light through it? Like I'm thinking on the side of the light rail cars where there's an advertisement, but there's some transparency to it. Are we accounting for that?
yeah, so I think in that case, I think we'd have to see just how opaque that is.
I'm trying to avoid where somebody puts a full height sticker on it, but they say, well, it's 25%.
Right.
It's 75% transparent, but it's covering the whole window.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that meets the intent.
I agree with Commissioner.
Right.
Yep.
And that stuff's out there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So maybe I'll look at some way to incorporate that or address that.
These are the types of items I'm glad I'm not a city, work in the city planning department.
A lot of detail there.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? All right, this next one, kind of along the lines of it's kind of nitpicky, and I apologize if you hear my kids running out of their bath right now. But we do limit in our mixed-use districts the number of drive-through lanes. You might recall this from the bank that recently went in over at Oxborough here, where you have we had kind of the building couldn't be between the drive-through couldn't be between the building and the street, and create that street activation. But we also limit the number of drive-through lanes to one drive-through. You know, obviously limit that. But the intent was not to be one drive-through per site per se, because you might have a large site like this where their drive-through might still be able to be accommodated. And the way it was written, it could be interpreted either as one drive-through per site or one lane.
Do we need any clarification that it is one per building and the drive-through has to be associated with that building? Versus, to your point, there may be a big site, 3 buildings, and one building wants to have all 3 drive-through lanes on its building.
Mm. Or additionally, I would ask like a site like Sonic that has the main building and then has covered area around it. Is that considered 2 buildings?
Mr. Palermo, I apologize for not being as prepared on this one as I should be. So we are, the spirit of this is limiting it to 1 lane per building.
Yes. Yep.
We have a number of drive-throughs, et cetera, that have multiple today. They would become non-conforming.
If they're in these zoning districts, they would technically, they probably are legally non-conforming, because that was kind of the intent all along, was to be one drive-through lane. But I'm trying to think of, so like the Wells Fargo across the street is legally non-conforming with its two or three drive-through lanes. The thought being, if that ever redevelops, they would have to come into conformance with one drive-through lane.
Again, I apologize for being less prepared on this one. Why are we doing this?
So these standards are intended to, in this case, this example, rather than the drive-through wrapping around the bank, and with a double drive-through, we're trying to encourage that pedestrian aspect in these mixed-use districts. So the B4, the C3, and the C5 and LX, which is where we are trying to create that pedestrian activity and kind of reduce that car dependency. But if we're encouraging multiple drive-through lanes, you're just driving more traffic through there. So we're not at the point where we're going to get rid of drive-throughs altogether, but we want to kind of keep them to one lane and keep them where they're not blocking that access to the building.
Thank you for that. I was missing the emphasis of the zoning districts, that these are mixed use, highly active. This is not like a citywide ordinance.
Yep.
Thank you.
Right. Yep. No problem.
I think Mr. Markegard has something to ask or say here as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Cookton, staff has always interpreted this to be one per building in those districts. Without those words per building, if you read it literally, it sounds like you can only have one anywhere in, all four of those districts combined. So we don't view this as a change, but rather a clarification that would match our interpretation. And since we've had these districts, have not had any sites that have more than one drive-through lane within the districts. Now, there may have been some that were there when they were rezoned, but they would already be legally non-conforming today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the reason I brought up this example is this is one where we have that single drive-through, but who knows? There's enough space here to do a similar type of situation here on this corner, Does that answer everyone's questions? Okay.
Yeah.
This is one I believe you had encountered recently. We do have some properties that are not platted with our block and lot style. We typically do require with additions or certain permits to come into conformance and plat properties. But we do have some examples here where we kind of, you don't have to come into conformance with that platting requirement. And we thought it would also make sense for just small additions, so under 1,000 square feet, to incorporate that into that exemption as well. So less impactful. You still need final site and building plans approved by the planning manager, and kind of fits into just how we handle some of these other exemptions. Any questions on this?
Nope.
This is another one where it's kind of more on interpretation. So we want to clarify that circular driveways, right now, our circular driveway language is nested in our second curb cut language, which some, like this top left example, is where you would have a second curb cut, but these other ones are examples where you have a circular driveway that kind of comes in on itself. So it makes sense to kind of create its own little section, just acknowledging that not all circular driveways require a second curb cut. But the more important part of that is also that the main part of the driveway can be wider, but on that kind of secondary part where it loops back, it needs to be limited to 12 feet. So this is something that we are in the code kind of now, but it gets lost because of that second curb cut discussion.
Does that that would get calculated in impervious surface on a lot, correct?
Yep, that would still apply. Yep.
And we just
can kind of see in this example
because it's
kind
not
of
the primary driveway.
Right. It's a little bit wider on these sides because it's going to your 2-car garage, but as you loop back around, it's limited in size. Any other comments? This one we have in our use table. We call out in this section that daycare facilities are permitted as accessory use in our industrial zoning districts. It is accessory in all the zoning districts except FD2, which was a conditional use. So this would just be adding the language conditional use in there just to clarify that accessory or conditional use doesn't change how we apply it. So as you can see, these are getting a little bit easier. This is another one, the clear view triangle. We talk about it in multiple spots in the code, and it's consistent throughout the code, but we don't have a single spot where we define it. So in fact, this graphic is in our sign section. It just makes sense to have it rooted somewhere in our definition section. So this definition is kind of what's found throughout the code. So having that in that definition section kind of clarifies something to point to and easily define. So nothing new here, but just adding that to the definitions. Then item C is just amending some of our language as it pertains to group homes or residential care facilities. The state, they have both licensed and registered. So our code currently just says licensed throughout. So we want to add kind of that registered language there, and then just kind of consistency with how Department of Human Services and just adding those. So not changing how we're applying our code at all, but just making sure we're being consistent with state code. And I believe we're also referencing an outdated part of state statute that has changed from G to H. So just making sure we're updating those references.
Sounds good.
And then this one, we define pet services facility. But we had in our list of kind of what is a pet services facility, animal sales, veterinary clinic, we just had sales, which kind of, to us, kept it a little too broad and open for someone to say, well, I'm doing general retail sales, I'm a pet services facility. We didn't want just general retail in there. You can still kind of do sales, accessory, or customarily incidental, like at a veterinary clinic, you know, they do some food sales or pharmaceutical sales. That would still be allowed, but we didn't want to keep it open as with that general sales. That makes sense?
Makes sense.
And then cleanup items. These are pretty straightforward. We had several instances where we still said BP1 and BP2. If you remember, we changed it to just our bluff protection. We don't have the distinction anymore. We had some pet services reference was missing in our use table. We do actually have a performance standard section that we wanted to reference in our use table. Our crematorias was in the wrong, referencing outdated standard that was moved from 19 to 21. So that was pointing to the wrong section of the code. Similar situation with service standards was pointing to the wrong section of the code, and our exterior storage performance standards were incorrectly referenced as well. So sometimes we move these around and we try and catch as many as we can, but sometimes it just gets lost because they're buried somewhere. And yeah, it just kind of happens from time to time. And with that, any questions or comments? I think we've had a few little tweaks and clarifications here that I can incorporate as I bring these back. Any other issues?
The only other one that came to mind was one of the applications tonight. There was a reference to thin brick being considered a secondary material. And I'm wondering if, given the changes in technology, if it's appropriate to, or maybe this isn't the time. Maybe we still, maybe it needs more study, and it would be next year. But I know projects that we do at the university we use thin brick a lot, and it's just as good as regular brick. And so I'm wondering if within changes, if we should be looking at whether or not that would be an allowable primary material. So something
to give you a little peek into how we remember all of these, we actually have a spot in our intranet where we can make a comment, and when it comes to that time of year, I kind of go through them all, and so I could add that into that list so that we remember it and do a little more research on that and make sure it comes back at the next round if that works for you.
That's fine. That's going to happen to be on the agenda tonight, which triggered me, which I had thought about it before, but timing was there. But thanks work on all this to you and all the team.
Yeah, you guys done a nice job here. I'll hold my comment for maybe item number 4. I don't know that it's necessarily for a cleanup. I'm just looking for a little status as an item we talked about maybe two years ago or more. Anything else for us, Mr. Palermo?
That was it.
All right.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think we're planning for March 3rd to come back as a public hearing. So.
Sounds good. All right. With that, let's move on to. I think. Yeah. Boy, missing it on my planning commission synopsis. Should probably go to that next before policy and issue update. So, commission members, we have a planning commission synopsis in front of us for February 3rd. And if I recall correctly, Commissioner Goldsman and Commissioner Corman were absent during that meeting, but we still do have a quorum that would be able to approve the Planning Commission synopsis. So with that, I would entertain a motion to approve by any of the other members. Commissioner Roman.
So moved.
All right, we have a motion by Commissioner Roman. Is there a second? Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right, thank you. All right, commission members, we have a motion to approve the draft Planning Commission meeting synopsis of January 13th, 2022 as presented. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Goldsman?
Abstain?
Thank you. Commissioner Corman?
Abstain.
Thank you. Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Cookdon?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Planning Commission synopsis for January 13th are approved. Moving on to item number 4, Mr. Markegard, Planning Commission policy and issue update.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, looking ahead to our next 2 meetings. Your next meeting is in 2 weeks on February 17th. We just have 2 items on that agenda. Conditional use permit, final site and building plans for a new school on Lindale Avenue. And then the second item is a study discussion on hotel and office conversions to residential. And then 2 weeks beyond that, on March 3rd, we just have 1 item so far on the agenda, and that is the miscellaneous issues ordinance public hearing, the study item you just discussed. That's all I have tonight.
All right, thank you. Commission members, anything else you'd like to be brought up for staff for consideration or discussion? I'm going to bring up just one item, and only because we brought it up today. A couple of years ago, we did discuss charging stations, and I don't recall. We had some discussion about definitions and things like that, and I'm just thinking, as certainly charging stations at that point, I think were kind of well, they haven't received the amount of federal attention, number one, and or state attention for implementing quite like they have in this last year. So I'm wondering if there's anything we need to be thinking about in the future for the city of Bloomington for vehicle electrification. So, or requesting of Met Council for that as well. So, with that, Commissioner Goldsman.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to brush up on, and I need to do a little bit more research for myself as well, as I know a few years ago we talked about food trucks and having standards around food trucks here in Bloomington. I know right now it's the winter time, but come spring and the new brewery coming in, that might be a topic we just want to make sure we're on top of before the warm weather comes. And then the other topic that I remember us talking about in some study session was really around the electric scooters or bike share programs. I know some of our cities had some show up a few years ago on their corners, and I know we talked a little bit about having standards around those. And so as we get closer and closer to summer, that might be another topic that we want to just make sure that we're ready for before it's here.
All right. Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wasn't sure, Mr. Margard, if we have any update from the city manager on the status of how long our remote meeting situation is intended to continue, or if maybe there's not an answer yet.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman, no updates on that. They're following the numbers closely, and as those numbers change, I'm sure there will be a change in policy, but the change hasn't been made yet.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. And just as I understand, we had that brief update, but it's this fall, this winter, when we find out if there's anything on World Expo. Is that right? I just want to verify with folks. Yep, I see Nellie shaking her head, so she's got it.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, in terms of the Expo decision, I understand that we'll now move into 2023 based on the schedule Mr. Rudling presented the other night. We had been thinking there would be a decision by November of 22, but it sounds like it will now be a little bit into 23.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right, Commission members, anything else for staff? Not seeing any. And with that, we'll conclude our February 3rd Bloomington Planning Commission meeting. Thank you.